Welcome back to CSS Breakdown, Book by Book Season 2. We're exploring an introduction to criminological theory by Roger Hopkins Burke. In Episode 10, we delve deeper into the structural roots of crime with conflict and radical criminological theories. So today, we're really stepping back, aren't we? Moving away from looking at crime purely through, individual choices or maybe psychology or even small group dynamics.
Yeah, we've covered some fascinating ground there in past deep dives.
Definitely. But now, with our source, Hopkins Burke's book, we're aiming for the really big picture, society's structure itself. The question becomes, could the way society is set up fundamentally be what's driving crime? Not just who does it, but how we even define it, how we react. It's a real shift in perspective.
It absolutely is. These theories, which we can broadly group as conflict and radical theories, they move away from that idea of societal consensus.
The idea that we all basically agree on the role.
Exactly. The assumption that society hangs together because we share values. Instead, these theories start from the idea that society is, well, inherently marked by conflict.
Conflict is the norm, not the exception.
Pretty much. It's seen as this constant struggle, often unequal, between different groups. They're all vying for power, for resources, for the ability to shape things their way.
And the book divides these into sort of two main streams, conflict theory and radical theory.
That's right. Conflict theory often looks at it as this pluralist struggle, lots of different groups competing. Then you have radical theory, which itself has variations, but it's heavily influenced by Marxist ideas. So it tends to see the core conflict rooted in class struggle, in the dynamics of capitalism.
But the common thread is rejecting that consensus idea.
That's the key. Any apparent harmony from these viewpoints is probably temporary, maybe even engineered. It's the result of one group, or maybe several, managing to assert dominance and keep conflict sort of managed in their favor.
So the goal for these theorists is to unpack that power struggle.
Precisely. To dissect the fight for power and authority and show how that shapes crime, what we call crime, and how we respond to it.
Okay, so our mission today, using the book, is to really get into the nuts and bolts of these perspectives. We want to see how they challenge mainstream criminology, putting power and inequality right at the center of understanding crime. Let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Right, so thinking back to labeling theory, we saw how potent those labels are. Being called deviant or criminal, it's not just a description, it can actually change things for a person.
Yeah, it shapes identity and behavior.
But a big critique, and the source highlights this, was that labeling theory didn't fully explain why some groups seem to have way more power to make those labels stick. Why are certain people the labelers and others the labeled?
And that's exactly the gap conflict and radical theories try to fill. They really emerged partly as a direct answer to that critique. Labeling showed the process.
That's how it happens.
Right. But these theories wanted to dig into the structural inequalities behind it. Who gets the authority to define deviance? Whose behavior is most likely to get flagged as problematic? They started pulling in ideas from sociology, economics, politics, to understand the power structures underneath the labeling.
And Thorsten Sellin was one of the early figures connecting crime directly to this idea of conflict.
Yes, Thorsten Sellin, back in 1938, he was influenced by George Simmel, the sociologist who saw conflict everywhere in social life. Sellin took that and basically said, conflict itself is a major cause of crime. He called it culture conflict theory.
Culture conflict, what's the core idea there?
Sellin argued that every distinct culture develops its own conduct norms. Think of them as the unwritten rules, the expectations, the do's and don'ts you absorb growing up in that culture through family, community, everything.
So the norms guiding your behavior come from your specific cultural background.
Exactly. And Sellin's point was, imagine a perfectly homogeneous society. Everyone shares the same culture, same values. In that case, the conduct norms would eventually become the formal laws. People would generally accept them because they reflect their own values.
Makes sense. Laws match the culture.
But, Sellin said, whenever that cultural homogeneity breaks down, you inevitably get culture conflict.
And where does this clash happen? Where do these different norms bump heads?
Sellin saw it on two levels. First, the macro-level conflict between large societal cultures. This is pretty obvious, historically, like border disputes, or when one culture takes over another's territory.
Or migration today.
Migration is the classic modern example, yeah. People move, bring their different conduct norms, and suddenly you have these different rule sets existing side by side under one legal system.
Okay, so big cultural clashes. What about the micro level?
The micro level happens within one larger culture. This is usually about subcultures developing inside the main society, each with its own conduct norms. In this situation, the laws of the bigger society almost always reflect the norms of the dominant culture.
So the subculture's norms, even if perfectly normal within that group.
Can end up being in direct conflict with the law. The law reflects the dominant group's values, not necessarily theirs.
The book used that example about a man finding his wife with someone else.
It's a really vivid illustration.
Yeah.
Sellin pointed out that different cultures have vastly different unwritten rules for that situation. In some traditional societies, the norm might even require a violent response. The husband is culturally expected to kill them both, maybe.
Not just allowed, but expected.
It's the norm, yes. But contrast that with modern, complex societies. Often there's no single, clear script. There's ambiguity, confusion, maybe conflicting feelings or expectations. For Sellin, this clash, or even just the lack of clear norms in a complex society, can lead to behavior being defined as criminal. You might follow your own culture's norms, but they violate the dominant legal code.
Which seems super relevant in diverse societies today.
Absolutely. Think about different cultural views on honor, family obligations, how you resolve disputes. These can easily clash with the formal legal system.
It really reframes crime then. It's not just about morality, but about whose code gets enforced.
And it's important to distinguish Sellin's subcultures from, say, Cohen's or Cloward and Olin's deviant subcultures.
Right, those were more about reacting against the mainstream.
Yeah, often finding alternative ways to get mainstream goals or rejecting dominant values. Sellin's subcultures aren't necessarily reacting against anything. They just have different, independently developed norms and values. The crime happens purely because of the clash when they meet the dominant legal system.
Okay, so norms clash. How does that play out in society structure, especially thinking about power? This brings us to other thinkers, right, like Louis Kosar.
Right. Kosar also drew from Simmel, but came at it slightly differently. Interestingly, he was a functionalist sociologist.
Functionalist, doesn't that usually emphasize harmony?
Usually, yes, but Kosar had strong left-wing leanings, which is an interesting combination. He focused less on where the conflicting norms came from and more on the intensity of conflict itself. What makes conflict flare up or die down?
And what did he find about conflict intensity?
He had several propositions. One, counterintuitively perhaps, was that conflict gets more intense if powerful groups try to suppress it.
Trying to keep a lid on it makes it worse.
Exactly. It builds pressure. He also said conflict is more intense when people fight for a group, not just themselves. And, quite insightfully, that conflict can be fiercest in close relationships where love and hate can coexist.
That point about close relationships feels very true to life.
It does. Kosar also talked about conflict potentially having safety valve functions, or how overlapping group memberships might affect social stability. Like Simmel, he saw the offender as sort of an ever-present figure, but with a more functionalist lens, maybe crime serves some societal need, like clarifying boundaries.
Okay, so Kosar looks at conflict's intensity. How does this group conflict idea link more directly to law and criminalization? George Vold comes in here.
George Vold is crucial for that link. He really built on this idea of society as competing groups. For Vold, society isn't unified by consensus. It's a collection of groups constantly jostling for position, trying to protect and advance their interests.
Competing for power, resources, influence.
Everything. He saw groups as perpetually watchful, wary of each other, always struggling to improve their standing.
And this struggle, for Vold, directly shapes crime and law.
Absolutely central. Vold's core argument is that the whole system, making laws, breaking laws, enforcing laws, is a direct reflection of these underlying conflicts between group interests. It's all part of a struggle for control over the state's power, especially its police power.
So the law isn't neutral ground, it's the battleground.
That's the idea. And because minority groups, almost by definition, have less power to influence legislation.
Their interests don't get written into law.
Right, so their behavior, their norms, are the ones most likely to be defined as criminal by the dominant group. And that legal definition then legitimizes the state, the police, the courts, stepping in to enforce those dominant group norms.
This sounds a lot like labeling theory again, but grounded in group power struggles and the state. Did Austin Turk take this further?
He did, and the connection to labeling is definitely there. But Turk's main focus, his real theoretical puzzle, wasn't explaining different types of crime. What counts as crime changes, right?
Yeah, over time and place.
So Turk focused on the process of criminalization itself. How does someone get assigned that criminal status? Why does it stick? And, maybe most importantly, why do people accept the authority that applies these labels?
Why do we see the law as legitimate even when it targets certain groups?
That was Turk's big question. He saw social order not as consensus, but as powerful groups controlling society for their own benefit.
And how did he think they exercised this control?
Through a couple of key mechanisms. First, by giving the law a normative justification. Laws aren't just rules. They're presented as being based on morality or shared values and then enforced by agencies like the police. In his earlier work, he suggested that people who are less aware of how the powerful see things, who maybe misread the situation and break dominant norms, are more likely to get caught.
Which could explain why younger people might be more vulnerable, less sophistication about the system's expectations.
That was his argument there, yeah. But his later work detailed two main control methods: coercion and something more subtle, the control of legal images and living time.
Coercion is straightforward force, or the threat of it.
It's the obvious one, physical force. But Turk noted a paradox. The more you rely on sheer force, the less legitimate your control becomes. People resent it. It's unstable long term.
Okay, so what about the second method? Control of legal images and living time. That sounds more complex.
It is, and it's where Turk gets really insightful about how power works subtly. First, legal images. The law has formal rules, procedures, due process, equality before the law. It projects this image of fairness.
The law in books.
Exactly. But alongside that, there's always discretion. Police decide who to stop, prosecutors decide who to charge, judges decide sentences. Turk argued powerful groups manipulate this gap between the formal rules and the informal use of discretion. They use it to serve their interests while keeping up the appearance of a fair, impartial system.
So the system looks fair, but its application can be biased.
That's the idea. It maintains legitimacy while allowing for inequality in practice. The second part, control of living time, is maybe even more profound.
Living time.
It suggests that if control and domination are consistent enough, pervasive enough, over generations, people just get used to it. It becomes the background noise, the way things are. Later generations might forget things were ever different, or even that alternative ways of organizing society are possible. The inequality becomes normalized simply through its persistence.
Wow, that's a powerful idea. Control becomes invisible because it's always been there. It explains why people might accept inequality without constantly fighting back.
It's a key explanation for social stability despite inequality, yeah.
Now, moving from Turk, the source introduces Richard Quinney, who also starts in conflict theory but moves towards more radical Marxist ideas later on.
Quinney's another key figure in that transition. His early work, like Turk's, was very much influenced by labeling and social reaction perspectives. He saw crime not as inherent in an act, but as a product of legal definitions created by political power.
Similar to Vold again, law as a tool of power.
Very much so. And Quinney gave sharp examples. He pointed out how actions causing similar harm get treated totally differently depending on who does them. If a less powerful person causes a death, it's likely murder or manslaughter.
Criminal court, serious charges.
Right. But if a corporation or a high-status person causes similar harm, maybe even multiple deaths, through negligence, pollution, unsafe products, it's much more likely to be framed as a civil issue, a regulatory problem, or just an accident.
So the definition hinges less on the harm, more on the perpetrator status.
That was Quinney's core observation. He really zeroed in on harmful activities by the powerful corporate crime, political corruption, safety violations that often get ignored, excused, or treated minimally by the criminal justice system. They're effectively placed outside the realm of real crime.
And he also looked at the media's role in this.
He did. He saw the mass media as crucial in shaping our understanding. They don't just report crime. They actively define what counts as crime and what doesn't. They construct a social reality where street crime is the big danger, while maybe more harmful corporate actions are downplayed or normalized.
He summed up his early conflict view in 6 propositions.
Yes, they're a good snapshot of his thinking then. 1. Crime is basically a definition created by authorized agents in a political society. 2. These definitions get applied by the segments of society who have power over law enforcement. 3. And specifically, power over the administration of the law, police, courts, etc. 4. People's behavior patterns are structured in relation to these definitions. Your actions have a certain probability of being labeled deviant depending on your place in the power structure. 5. Our general ideas about crime, what we think it is, are constructed and spread through communication, like the media. 6. So the social reality of crime is built up by all these things. Making the definitions, applying them, how people behave in response, and how we talk and think about it all.
That really frames crime as a social construction, deeply tied to power and how we define things.
It's a direct challenge to seeing crime as just an objective fact or individual failing. And it really paves the way for the more structural critiques of radical theories.
Okay, so conflict theories, through thinkers like Turk and Quinney, gave us this really important lens on power and law. But, like all theories, they faced criticisms, right?
Oh, absolutely. Particularly from the later radical criminologists, especially in the UK. They felt that while conflict theory acknowledged conflict, it was maybe conservative in the end.
Too comfortable with the idea that conflict might just lead to integration or balance, rather than demanding revolution.
Something like that, yeah. The critique was that it didn't fully embrace conflict as needing a fundamental transformation of society. Another big criticism was about the individual. Some felt conflict theories didn't adequately explain why someone facing an unfair system would rationally choose to offend.
It leaned too much towards a predestined actor model, like people were just pushed into crime by forces or labels.
That was the concern. Not enough focus on agency or rational choice, even if it's constrained choice. Critics also said they didn't really explain why we have the specific laws we do beyond just serving group interests. And a major puzzle was, why don't subordinate groups who get a raw deal resist more? Why the relative acceptance of stable authority relationships?
And how does someone like Turk explain that lack of resistance from subordinate groups?
Well, Turk's explanation was pretty controversial. He basically attributed their problems, their rule-breaking, to a lack of sophistication.
Lack of sophistication, that sounds a bit judgmental.
It was definitely seen that way. The implication was that they get into trouble because they don't understand the powerful people's perspective. Critics jumped on this, saying it basically dismisses the experiences of the underdog and validates the official accounts of the police version, the court version, over the subjective reality of those being processed.
Which is the opposite of what labeling theorists like Howard Becker wanted to do, right? He wanted to give voice to the underdog.
Exactly. Becker saw the researcher's job as amplifying those marginalized voices against the superordinate groups in power.
So Turk's view, while describing power dynamics, was seen by some as kind of reinforcing them.
Yes, and it led to accusations of an implicit correctionalist stance, too. Remember his suggestion about forcibly breaking up deviant subcultures?
Yeah, force them to integrate.
Right. Coerce them back into the mainstream, regardless of their own views or interests. It seemed to prioritize conformity over understanding their perspective.
But you mentioned Quinney was different on this point about individual agency.
Very different, especially in his later work. Quinney moved decisively away from any hint of a predestined model. He argued that acts labeled criminals aren't just symptoms of bad socialization or personality flaws. He saw them as conscientious actions.
Conscious acts, like deliberate resistance.
Yes. He adopted more of a rational actor view, suggesting these acts were deliberate responses to an unequal social order. Maybe, he argued, they were the only way for people to express their feelings about powerlessness and inequality. He even had this somewhat romantic notion that such deviant acts held the potential for social change by challenging the system.
That's a huge shift. The criminal isn't just passive or pathological, but potentially an active agent, rationally responding to injustice.
It gives agency back to the individual within that structural critique. Their actions become meaningful responses to their reality.
And that idea, crime as a response to structural inequality, feels like a perfect bridge to the radical theories heavily influenced by Marxism.
It absolutely is. Radical theories, like conflict theories, are a diverse group. The big moment, especially in the UK, is often marked by Taylor, Walton, and Young's The New Criminology in 1973. They tried to fuse labeling theory insights with Marxist analysis. Meanwhile, in the US, people like Chambliss and Quinney in his later phase were developing similar radical views, maybe from slightly different starting points.
And you mentioned Marxism itself isn't one single thing.
No, definitely not. When we say Marxist influence, it covers a range. There's the basic two-class model, bourgeoisie versus proletariat, sometimes criticized as vulgar Marxism if applied too simply. There's instrumental Marxism law as just a direct tool of the ruling class. Again, sometimes seen as a bit crude.
More nuanced versions.
Yes, like structural Marxism, which sees dominance maintained through controlling institutions and ideas, not necessarily deliberate plots. The Frankfurt School brought in Freudian ideas. And neo-Marxism sometimes looked at the lumpenproletariat, the underclass, as disruptive but not revolutionary.
So a lot of different threads. Who were some early figures linking capitalism directly to crime?
Wilhelm Blonger, writing way back in 1916, is a key early example. He argued capitalism itself breeds egoism and irresponsibility, making it the root cause of crime.
And he connected economic cycles to crime rates?
He did. He looked at the relationship between boom-bust cycles and crime. His argument was simple. Recessions lead to unemployment, which leads to more crime. Using a basic two-class model, he saw the conflict as inherent in capitalism's contradictions, pushing self-interest over social good, hence crime.
The system itself is criminogenic.
That's the core idea. Then you have Rush and Kirchheimer in 1939 looking specifically at imprisonment rates historically.
And what did they find about prisons and the economy?
They saw prison populations rising and falling with the business cycle. This led to their surplus labor hypothesis.
Surplus labor. Prisons soak up people the economy doesn't need.
That's the hypothesis. Prisons act as a way to manage populations, mostly working-class men historically, who are surplus to economic requirements during downturns. When capital doesn't need their labor, the penal system steps in.
That's a very different view of prisons' economic management, not just punishment.
It changes the focus entirely, and it leads Marxist penology often to focus less on rehabilitation, which might just serve bourgeois interests by making workers fit for exploitation again, and more on abolishing prisons altogether, seeing them as tied to capitalism.
Gordon also saw crime as rational, tied to destruction.
David Gordon, yeah.
Yeah.
He argued crime as a rational response to capitalism's political and economic setup. Even non-economic goals like status, he said, are tied to your chances of material survival in that system.
And he had that instrumentalist view of the state.
He did. Seeing the state as a tool of the rulers, he looked at upper-world crime. His explanation for the often weak enforcement against corporate or elite crime was simple. The state protects the power and profits of the ruling class. Cracking down hard would hurt their interests.
Which brings us back neatly to Bill Chambliss and his study of vagrancy laws. That seems like a prime example of law serving powerful interests.
So it's probably the most famous empirical study in this tradition. Chambliss looked at 14th century English vagrancy laws and found they weren't really about controlling vagrants.
What were they about then?
They were designed to force laborers to accept work at low wages. This was crucial for landowners after things like the Black Death reduced the workforce, giving laborers more power. The law was basically a tool for wage suppression to ensure cheap labor for the powerful.
So the law in books looked neutral, but the law in action, its real purpose, was economic control.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates that distinction from legal realism.
And he developed this further with Robert Seidman in Law, Order, and Power.
Yes, in that 1971 book, they argued, interestingly with almost Durkheimian echoes, that growing complexity in society creates conflict between different roles and interests. This requires institutions like law to manage the friction.
Sounds functional again. Where's the power?
Here's the twist. While there's a functional need for order, the basis for sanctions, what gets punished and how, reflects the interests of dominant groups. But crucially, the application is done by bureaucracies, police, courts, which have their own interests. So the law in action is shaped by both elite interests and bureaucratic needs.
Ah, so it's not just direct control. The bureaucracy itself plays a role.
Right. Chambliss had seen this earlier. He noted the justice system often treats lower classes more harshly. Why? Bureaucratically, they're easier to process, less power, less money, less ability to fight back. They make the system look efficient.
Easier targets.
It seems that way. Chambliss and Seidman were critical, finding police often acted illegally, bypassed due process, partly due to discretion and lack of oversight.
And plea bargains reflect this power imbalance, too.
Heavily. Pressure to plead guilty means the powerless often surrender their trial rights. It shows the law in action differs vastly based on your resources.
Chambliss also had that point about deterrence being paradoxical.
Yeah, a really sharp observation. The system puts huge effort into punishing people least likely to be deterred, addicts, maybe crimes of passion.
While white-collar criminals who could be deterred often get lighter sentences.
Exactly. Those with status, reputation, wealth, arguably most deterrable, seem to face less severe consequences. Chambliss said this isn't failed deterrence, it's bureaucratic logic. Look tough on the powerless, easy targets. Avoid costly fights with the powerful.
The system protects itself more than it deters crime.
That was his argument. By the mid-70s, Chambliss fully embraced a Marxist framework, summarizing it in 9 propositions.
9 propositions for his radical view. Let's hear them.
Okay, here's Chambliss's radical summary. 1. Acts are defined criminal because it's in the ruling class's interest. 2. The ruling class can break laws with impunity. The subject class gets punished. 3. Penal law expands as industrial capitalism grows, widening the gap to coerce the subject class. 4. Crime reduces surplus labor by locking people up A&D, creating the crime industry, police, prisons, etc. Think Nils Christie's term. 5. Crime diverts the lower class's attention from their exploitation towards crime within their own class, stops them blaming the system. 6. Crime only exists as a reality because those who define it benefit from its presence. 7. Criminal behavior is rational, fitting the conditions of one's class position under capitalism. 8. Crime rates and types vary depending on a society's specific political economic structure. 9. Socialist society should have less crime because class struggle, the supposed root cause, is less intense or absent.
That's a really comprehensive, challenging framework. Number 4, the crime industry idea is particularly striking, society needing crime for jobs.
It really flips the script. Spitzer, in 75, add to this by focusing on surplus populations created by capitalism.
People the economy discards.
Right. He made a distinction. Social junk, marginalized but passive, not a threat, maybe chronic unemployed addicts, and social dynamite, those seen as dangerous, potentially disruptive or rebellious, maybe proto-revolutionaries.
Social junk versus social dynamite, stark terms.
They are, and this links to how the state manages them. Welfare, medicalizing deviance, treating crime as illness. These could be seen as ways to manage the junk, keep them quiet.
But the source mentioned a contradiction.
Yeah, Spitzer pointed out that the more the state spends on managing these populations, welfare, prisons, mental health, the more it exposes the state's own fiscal limits, the tension between needing control and affording it under capitalism.
Okay, so while U.S. radicals focused on economics and state functions, a similar movement in the U.K. brought in other influences.
Exactly. Late 60s, early 70s UK, a new wave of radical criminologists emerged. They were highly critical of mainstream criminology, seeing it as basically legitimizing capitalist inequality.
Who were they criticizing?
The state institutions law, police, even social work for upholding the status quo. They attacked the predestined actor models often used then, arguing these models just justified intervention by control agencies without tackling root causes.
And they wanted to restore agency to the deviant?
That was central. Restore dignity, see their actions as meaningful. Rejecting views of deviants as passive victims or just pathological, they wanted to see them as knowing people responding rationally, albeit sometimes rebelliously, to their circumstances.
So actions as potentially meaningful responses, not just symptoms.
Right. This focus on authenticity, combined with the critique of the state, how labeling, lawmaking, blaming serve powerful interests. Very similar concerns to the U.S. radicals in that respect.
Where did the U.K. group draw their ideas from?
A real mix. Early Chicago school sociology, definitely. Howard Becker and symbolic interactionism were huge influences. Also phenomenology, ethnomethodology, looking at how people make sense of their world. Plus anti-psychiatry and radical psychology like R.D. Laing.
A broad intellectual toolkit. Who were the key players?
Many were linked to the New Deviancy Conference at York University. People like Paul Rock, David Downs, Laurie Taylor, Stan Cohen, Ian Taylor, Jock Young. They started often from labeling interactionism and moved towards incorporating Marxism.
And they critiqued earlier Marxists like Bonger.
Yes, they found figures like Bonger too deterministic. His model predicted way more crime than actually happened just based on alienation. They felt it ignored the variety of responses people have to hardship, like Merton's ideas of retreatism or ritualism.
So they wanted a more nuanced Marxism that included labeling and individual responses.
Exactly. They aimed for a totalizing explanation, a fully social view of deviance. The idea was combine the best of labeling theory with contemporary Marxism to get the full picture, structure, process, individual action.
Which led to the landmark book, The New Criminology.
Taylor, Walton, and Young, 1973. It was like their manifesto. It critiqued past theories and very ambitiously tried to sketch out what a crime-free society would look like. It rested on some core assumptions.
What were those key assumptions?
Basically, 1. Crime is two-sided. The behavior itself and the power to label it criminal. 1. Crime is two-sided. 2. Capitalism is inherently criminogenic. It produces crime because of its built-in inequalities. 1. Crime is two-sided. 3. Therefore, to eliminate crime, you have to eliminate capitalism's inequality and the power need to criminalize.
Eliminate inequality, eliminate crime. That's the goal.
It's a radical goal.
Yeah.
They saw the state's power to criminalize making laws, prosecuting groups as serving powerful interests, adapting its methods over time, but always maintaining control for the dominant class.
So the state defining crime is a tool to keep the power structure intact.
That was the argument. The new criminology offered this big, macro view, locating crime's causes in capitalism's structure. Labeling was still important for understanding the process, but the structure was fundamental. And crucially, they still saw individuals as rational actors making choices, albeit choices constrained by that unequal structure. So, the new criminology presented this grand, unified vision. How did the field react? Was it immediately embraced?
Not exactly. Like any big theoretical statement, it faced significant criticism. Looking back now, it's often seen as quite utopian, maybe overly optimistic, reflecting the political mood of the early 70s. Critics felt its sheer generality, trying to explain everything, meant it lacked specific, testable theories for particular kinds of crime.
And the authors themselves seem to pull back a bit later.
Yes, a 1975 edited collection by them is often seen as a move away from that initial grand theory towards more specific issues. The source outlines 5 main reasons often cited for this shift.
Okay, what were those reasons?
First, philosophical doubts about merging labeling theory and Marxism. Critics like Paul Hurst argued they were fundamentally incompatible. Were Taylor and colleagues truly integrating them, or just adding a radical gloss to labeling theory by borrowing Marxist terms?
A clash of basic assumptions. What's the second reason?
Second, the definition of crime. The new criminologists wanted to define crime broadly as social harm, moving beyond just legal definitions. But critics found this incredibly problematic.
Why was social harm so difficult?
How do you create one theory that explains shoplifting, rape, and corporate pollution under the single banner of social harm? How do you measure or compare these harms? Critics argued this broad definition made a unified theory impossible. Maybe different harms need different explanations, dissolving the idea of a single criminology.
The definition itself undermined the project. Third reason.
Third, influential historical and sociological studies emerged, like E.P. Thompson's work on the English working class or Douglas Hayes on the 18th century rule of law. These showed a more complex picture.
How did they challenge the radical view?
They showed the rule of law wasn't just simple repression. It could actually offer protections, even to the working class, from both elite abuses and other crime. State power and law were more contradictory and layered than the new criminology's initial model suggested.
Reality was messier. Fourth reason.
Fourth, changes within Marxist theory itself. The early new criminologists often used a simpler, instrumentalist view of the state. But Marxist thought in the 70s evolved, focusing more on culture, ideology, Gramsci's concept of hegemony, how dominance is maintained through consent and ideas, not just force.
So the theoretical ground shifted under them.
A bit, yeah. Law started to be seen as more complex than just a ruling class tool. Maintaining hegemony might require appearing fair, even making concessions.
Did later radicals try to incorporate these newer Marxist ideas?
Yes. Thinkers associated with Stuart Hall at Birmingham University, for example. Their book, Policing the Crisis on the Mugging Panic, used Gramscian ideas of hegemony to analyze race, class, and state power. This work is a key source for later critical criminology, though its wider impact outside academia hasn't been debated.
Okay, and the fifth and final reason for the retreat.
This was perhaps the most direct political pressure. Rising crime rates, or at least the public perception of them, and widespread fear of crime. This opened the door for populism in criminology.
Populism, appealing directly to people's fears.
Exactly. Conservative populists, the right realists, started directly addressing working-class concerns about crime, issues the left had perhaps neglected while focusing on structural critique. They gained political ground by taking victimization seriously.
So the right seemed more in touch with everyday realities of crime.
That was the political dynamic. In response, a group of left realists emerged from the radical tradition. They wanted to recapture the issue.
And what was the left realist position?
They still agreed capitalism and inequality were root causes. But they emphasized that most common crime, street crime, burglary, is predatory, and its main victims are the working class and the poor, the very groups they wanted to defend.
So crime wasn't primarily political resistance, but often poor people hurting other poor people.
That was the crucial shift. It forced an acknowledgement of working-class victimization and the need for practical solutions. Alongside the ongoing structural critique, it was a major recalibration.
That left realist perspective really brings it back to the lived experience of crime. This whole discussion, from conflict to radicalism, really pushes us to look beyond the individual, doesn't it? To see crime woven into power, inequality, the structure itself.
It absolutely forces different questions. Not just why did this person do it, but why is this act illegal? Whose interest does the law serve? How do power and inequality shape both behavior and our reactions to it?
For listeners wanting to dig deeper, the book suggests some key texts.
Definitely. For the U.S. side, look at Chambliss, Quinney, Turk. For the U.K. radical tradition, Taylor, Walton, and Young's Eyes. The new criminology is essential, maybe their later edited book too. Nils Christie on the crime industry is fascinating, and the Birmingham schoolwork, like Policing the Crisis, leads towards critical criminology.
Great pointers. So, wrapping up, conflict and radical theories demand we see crime not just as individual acts, but as deeply embedded in societal power struggles, inequality, and how law itself is created and used.
And thinking about that, given how these theories show this intricate link between power, law, inequality, and the very definition of crime, it leaves us with a pretty challenging thought, doesn't it? If crime's existence and definition are so tied up with these unequal structures and power struggles, what does that really mean for the possibility of ever creating a society that's truly, completely crime-free? Is such a thing even conceivable within these frameworks?
A profound question indeed. Is crime something we can eliminate, or is it an inherent feature as long as inequality persists? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into conflict and radical criminological theories from an introduction to criminological theory.
Thank you. Certainly a lot to think about.
We'll be back next time exploring more from the world of criminological theory.